Welcome, everyone. I'm Kevin Volpp. I'm a professor at both the Perelman School, the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, and the founding director of the Center for Health Incentives and Behavioral Economics at the University of Pennsylvania. We are thrilled to have you here today as part of our new seminar series focused on behavioral science and health. And I am joined today by Katy Milkman, a professor at Wharton and co-director of the Behavior Change for Good initiative, who's co-sponsoring this talk with us. Katy?
Hi, everyone. I'm thrilled to get to introduce our guest speaker today. And we were joking beforehand, I have to say, about the introduction for the introducer. So sorry that Nicholas is going to not introduce anyone. He's just going to introduce science. But I'm really excited that we have Dr. Nicholas Christakis with us. He is the Sterling Professor of Social and Natural Science at Yale University. He directs the Human Nature Lab and the Yale Institute for Network Science. And he has truly done inspiring work. His groundbreaking research explores how human biology and health intersect with social networks, influencing behavior and public health outcomes. And he's authored a lot of fantastic and influential books that I highly recommend, including Connected and Blueprint. His research has shaped policy and public understanding of social dynamics, and we're just so grateful that he has taken time out of his busy schedule to present to us. So today he's going to be talking about social network interventions. Please join me in giving him a warm welcome, which I think there might be a way for you to do by, showing emojis or something. And if not, you can just do it privately at home or in your office. Yay, there, I see things are happening. This is great. Okay, so to the audience, I'm supposed to give you one set of instructions before I disappear, which is to please put your questions for Dr. Christakis in the Q&A, and then you can also upvote, and that will help us discern which ones you want to have asked. And Kevin will pop back on to do Q&A after about a 40-minute presentation. So let me pass the baton to Nicholas. Thank you so much for joining us. We're just thrilled to have you here, and as you can see, the audience is very excited.
Thank you both, Kevin and Katy. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for that introduction. So human beings are embedded in social networks, and these networks obey very particular mathematical, biological, psychological, and sociological rules. And taking these rules into account gives us great opportunities to intervene in social networks to make the world better. We can use an understanding of social network structure and function for good, to intervene not only in online, but also in offline networks to enhance things like health and our well-being. Now, I'm interested in real social networks, the kind we humans have been making for and embedding ourselves in for tens of thousands of years. And real social networks look like this. Every dot that you see on this image is a person. Every line represents some kind of relationship between two people. Whose friend or whose spouse or whose sibling or whose coworker, for example. And to my eye, social networks are intricate things of beauty. And they are so elaborate and so complex and so ubiquitous, in fact, and they have such a particular and regularly seen topological architecture that it has to be the case that their structure and function is not a coincidence. And in fact, humans evolved to have social networks with particular structures, such as that seen here, that underlie the processes of social influence and information diffusion that are concerned so many of us these days. People's attitudes, decisions, and behaviors depend in quantifiable ways on the attitudes, decisions, and behaviors of others to whom they are directly or indirectly connected. And empirically, this often stretches to 3 degrees of separation, such that your attitudes and behaviors depend on the attitudes and behaviors of your friends' friends, and your friends' friends. And as a result of that basic observation, a key idea about networks is that networks magnify whatever they are seeded with. If you put something in a network, the network functions as a kind of social magnifying glass. But networks are agnostic. They will magnify fascism and violence and misinformation and COVID, but they will also magnify love and kindness and happiness and ideas. But the network doesn't on its own give rise to these phenomena. Some external force has to impinge on the network to get the process started. They must be seeded. Now, experiments in my lab and in other labs around the world over the last 10 or 20 years have identified 3 broad ways to intervene in networks to enhance public health and public policy, to use social networks for good. One broad idea is that we can manipulate contagion and change the flows of something through the network. The second idea is that we say, well, we're going to manipulate connection. We're going to change the structure of the network. Who is connected to whom? And the last and most subtle idea is that we can manipulate position, which is changing the location of people within a network. A very simple example of that idea is that imagine you have a classroom with desks nailed to the floor that are empty, and those desks you see define a set of structural social interactions. Who's on your left, who's on your right, who's in front of you, who's behind you. Now imagine that you have a set of 20 students outside the classroom of differing abilities. The question is, where should you seat those students in the desks to maximize learning in this network of students, right? So it's the same students with the same abilities, but depending on how you position them in the seats, do you put the smart students in the front? Do you put them in the back? Do you mix them up? How do you handle it? That's a position intervention. And there's expanding science in all three areas in both online and offline settings. And I'd like to give you a feel for some of our results going back over 15 years ago this afternoon. Now, with respect to contagion, one of the reasons that it's important to do experiments is that you have to exclude two other possible explanations for the clustering of traits that one might see in observational data. So if you see people and their friends manifesting a similar trait, for example, whether your children are studious and they have studious friends, there are three possible explanations for that. One is this idea of social contagion or induction, a kind of social domino effect. So, for example, I gain weight, it makes my friends gain weight, my friends gain weight, it makes my friends' friends gain weight, and so on. A second idea is homophily, or birds of a feather flock together, the preferential attachment of people with similar traits. Maybe it's not that your weight gain causes my weight gain. Maybe we formed an attachment because we had a similar body size or similar interest in food or exercise to begin with. And a third possibility is not that my weight gain causes your weight gain, nor that we form an attachment because we have a similar body size, but rather that we jointly share an exposure to something like a gym that makes us both lose weight, or a fast food joint that makes us both gain weight at the same time, or a contextual factor. And typically, all three of these are present in any social phenomenon, and it takes effort using diverse econometric and experimental techniques to tease these three processes apart. So, for example, when your children are doing well in school, is it that their friends are good students and influencing them to perform? Is it that your good student child is preferentially attaching to other good student children? Or do they have a charismatic teacher that's making all of them perform well at the same time? Now, very early on, this was obvious to us and has been widely understood actually for over 200 years, this set of concerns. So we started doing experiments. And this was our first experiment that we published in 2010. In this experiment, groups of college students were brought into the laboratory. They were each given a sum of money, and they were randomly assigned into groups of 4 strangers, and they played something known as a public goods game. A public goods game is like the following. The 4 of us are put into a group. We're each told that if we contribute $1 to the group, that sum will be doubled, and then the money will be divided amongst all 4 members. So if I give $1, it becomes 2, it gets divided, everyone gets 50 cents. I've given $1 and only gotten back 50 cents, so that's a sacrifice for me, but the group gets much more money as a result. Of course, the optimal thing is for everyone to give maximally, then everyone will be doubling their money in every round. But we all intuit that many people will be tempted to defect and not contribute, hope everyone else contributes. And this conceptualization of a public goods game and a conceptualization of this type of prisoner's dilemma game or a cooperation game that I'm discussing is an old one. But what we were interested in was whether we could discern evidence for the contagion of altruism experimentally in these types of games. So groups of 4 students who are strangers were randomly assigned to play this game. Then a bell would ring and they'd be randomly assigned to new partners. Then a bell would ring and they'd be randomly assigned to new partners. And as a result, we created simple linear sequential networks of individuals. And what we found was that the effect with respect to altruism could spread across people. So for example, if a Lenny is as shown on this image, if Eleni is kind to Lucas in period 1, Lucas is kind to Erica in period 2, Erica is kind to Jay in period 3, and Jay is kind to Brecken in period 4. And this is one of the more bizarre results to come out of my lab in the last few years, because what I've just told you is that how Jay treats Brecken depends on how Eleni treated Lucas, even though neither Jay nor Brecken ever interacted with or saw Eleni or Lucas. So how two of the people on this session today, I can't see you all, so I'm just going to pick on how Kevin treats Samantha depends on how Joelle treated Megan, even though neither Kevin nor Samantha ever interacted with or saw Joelle or Megan. Here shown experimentally, so it cannot be homophily or confounding. It has to be social contagion. And this geodesic spread through the network, this step-by-step spread through the network highlighted in red, goes to 3 degrees of separation here in this experiment. And that geodesic spread is distinct from the temporal persistence of kindness highlighted in yellow, such that if Eleni is kind to Lucas, Lucas learns to be kind and is kind to Erica in period 2 and Lysander in period 3 and Bemi in period 4 and so on. In fact, in this type of an experiment, if you fold back all the downstream kindness, for every extra $1 that Eleni gave Lucas, the network functions as a kind of matching grant, doubling the downstream benefit. Now, real-life networks are not simple chains, however. They afford people within them different possible structural positions. This is a real social network. Every dot's a person. Every line is a relationship between two people. And if you look at this image, you can see that different individuals occupy different structural positions within the network. And there are many ways to characterize these differences, but 3 basic ways are shown on this image. For example, if you look at node B in the upper left and node D on the far right, B has 4 connections and D has 6 connections. This is known as the degree of a node, and it differs between those two people. But if you look at nodes C and D, you see that both C and D also each have 6 connections. But there's a difference between the two, and we, with a bird's eye view, can see that C and D are different. C is more central in the network. This is known as the centrality of a node. C's friends have more friends than D does. The friends of C are more central than the friends of D are. And finally, if you look at nodes A and B, they both have 4 connections, but the difference between the two is that A's friends are friends with each other, whereas B's friends are not friends with each other. And this is known as the transitivity of a node. So there are different ways we can understand, and as I'm going to show you, exploit an understanding of the structural position of individuals within networks. Here, for example, is one way you might exploit this to manipulate contagion. This is a paradigm of experiments we've been performing around the world in developing world settings, but it can also be done in classrooms, in hospitals, in firms, and so on. Imagine you have 2 villages on the left and on the right, and on the right-hand village, you have 6 people that you pick at random, shown in yellow, that you can target with some kind of public health or development economics intervention. The ordinary perspective in public health or development economics is you come back a year later and you see what fraction of those 6 individuals responded to the intervention, a maternal and child health intervention, or a vaccination intervention, or a anti-diarrheal intervention or something, or a farming technology intervention. The ordinary perspective is you come back in a year and you see what fraction of the 6 people responded, and maybe 3 of them responded. But that's not what I'm interested in. I'm not interested in response to treatment among the treated. I'm interested in response to treatment among the untreated. I want to know, what does everyone else in the village do when you target those 6 individuals? So maybe you target those 6 people, 3 of them respond, and maybe they persuade 3 of their friends to respond, such that in the treated village on the right, 6 total people respond to the intervention, whether they originally got it or not. And on the left, the control village, by secular change, maybe 2 people adopt the intervention. But now you should be able to imagine that, well, maybe I don't have to pick the 6 people at random. Maybe instead, like this slide, I can zoom in and pick the 6 people in the middle of the network. They're more central. Maybe here, once again, you target those 6 individuals, 3 of them respond, but they persuade 30 of their friends to respond. Same village, same intervention, same number of people targeted, maybe 10 times the response because of who you pick to target with the intervention, because of how structurally influential they might be. And in fact, then once we have this intuition, we can experiment with different algorithms for picking such potentially influential nodes. So maybe we don't just need to rely on how central they are, maybe there are other tricks we can exploit. And one problem, however, with implementing such a thing is that it's not always possible to map a network, to know who's central. It can be expensive or impractical. So the question is, how can we identify influential individuals without having to map network ties for a whole population? And it turns out there's a mathematical fact about social networks known as the friendship paradox, which is summarized in the observation that your friends have more friends than you do. This is actually quite a general principle about the organization of social networks. Your friends have more friends than you do. Your sexual partners have more sexual partners than you do. And then the thing that's very depressing for me as a scientist is that your co-authors have more co-authors than you do. So the point is that the friends of randomly chosen people have higher degree and are more central and possibly capable of inducing greater spillover effects than the random people themselves. So you can pick 6 yellow dots at random, then pick one of their friends at random and move 1 degree away from them to the orange dots. And you should see here intuitively that the orange dots are more central than the 6 original dots. Now, you can get a kind of intuitive appreciation for this by looking at this whole network and realizing that on the perimeter of the network, every single dot that's on the perimeter of the network, it must be the case that for them, their friends have more friends than they do. If you take 1 step away from any perimeter dot, their friends will have at least 2 friends and sometimes many more friends than they do. And it turns out that this holds throughout the network. And the reason this is fantastic is that you can actually go into a village, pick 6 yellow dots at random, ask them who their friends are, pick one of those friends at random, and find the orange dots without having to map the village. No network mapping is needed. You can implement this friendship nomination technique in this way. And we've been doing this now in multiple experiments around the world for about 15 years, showing that this can be done and can be used to maximize social contagion for good. Here's a snapshot of some of our work exploring this idea in rural Honduras, where, as I said, we've been working for over 15 years. This is a very poor part of the world. People live on about $2 a day. They're little hamlets of about 200, 300, 600 or 700 people. Our most recent experiment, we've done many, but our most recent one involved a large randomized controlled trial involving 176 villages shown on this map in the western highlands of Honduras in the Copan area, right up against the Guatemalan border. And there were 30,000 people in these 176 villages. And because it was a research project, we did map the networks in detail. And then we implemented a 2-year maternal and child health intervention with a randomized controlled trial of targeting algorithms. So the intervention was a standard intervention. The experiment was not about whether the intervention worked or not. The experiment was which targeting algorithm, how do we pick the people that maximizes the effect? And here's the design of the study, which we published in 2017. 176 villages, 30,000 people. We had an 8x2 factorial design, 11 villages in each of 16 cells. The cells varied in what percentage of the people were chosen in the village. 0, 5, 10, 20, 30, 50, 75, or 100% of the people in the village were chosen to get the intervention, and varied in a different axis. How were those people chosen? Were they chosen at random, or were they chosen using the friendship paradox, friendship nomination technique? And what we predicted would happen when we designed the study is shown in a little cartoon on the right. On the x-axis is the percent of people targeted. It goes from 0 to 100% because you can control that. And on the y-axis is the percent of people reached, which here goes from 0 to 50% arbitrarily, because no contagion reaches 100% of the people. So let's just imagine that up to 50% can adopt something. The dotted purple line shows what would be observed if there was no social effect. You target 100% of the people, 50% respond. You target 60% of the people, 30% respond, and so on. Of course, that's not what we expect. We all expect there to be this kind of sigmoidal curve shown in red because of a social effect. At low targeting fractions, like 20 or 30%, you give the people the intervention, but they don't respond because their neighbors haven't responded. The social effect suppresses adoption until you reach a critical threshold, and then you have this exponential growth. And now the social effect that worked against you now lowers the threshold. It's easier to persuade people to respond because all their neighbors have responded. And so you get that curve above the line in the red. What we wondered was, could we shift the curve to the left by using friendship nomination technique called the enhanced social effect, such that if we pick 20% of the people using the friendship nomination technique, we might find that it was just as good as if you had taught 100% of the people in the village this thing. And you should obviously see that this could be very powerful and would substantially increase the return on investment and the efficiency and not just efficacy of public health and development economic interventions. Our objective, you see, is to enhance the response to treatment among the untreated. This trial took many years of my life, and it was just published in Science about 6 months ago, or 8 months ago now, and the results were exactly as predicted. So here on the x-axis, we have the fraction targeted. On the y-axis, it's not exactly the same as the previous slide because the baseline was not always 0 in the outcome being targeted. So it's the percentage change in the outcome. And here are a couple of outcomes: knows that hand washing prevents respiratory illness, or sought care for a pregnancy danger sign. And the orange curves are shifted up and to the left compared to the blue curves. Now, the beauty of this is that friendship nomination, and we studied this for 117 outcomes, and details are in the paper about where it worked and why it worked. Now, the beauty of this is that friendship nomination is a scalable technique that doesn't require network mapping or extensive questions. Many people have been struggling to find ways to identify structurally influential people, but those typically require a lot of effort. You need to, have vast amounts of data where you know everyone's social interactions. That's not the case with friendship nomination. Just go into a village, pick people at random, ask them who their friends are, pick one of those friends at random, and treat that person. Part of the problem, however, with that approach is that people may not like that. You go into a village, you pick someone, and you say, who are your friends? And they tell you, and you say, thank you very much, and then you go give their friends something. So we began to experiment, both because of this sort of practical consideration and also for some mathematical structural reasons, with additional targeting algorithms. And one of our algorithms was this notion of pair targeting. So instead of going into a village, picking 10% of the people, asking them who their friends are, and targeting that other 10% who are their friends, go into a village, pick 5% of the people, ask them who their friends are, and take the combined 5 plus 5%, again, a total of 10%, and target those people using pair targeting. We did a randomized controlled trial of this using a completely different intervention to treat iron deficiency anemia in a completely different setting in Mumbai, India, and that study was published in PNAS a couple of years ago. This is where we worked. It's a very poor kind of urban, sort of lower, sort of upper working class, very lower middle class section of Mumbai. They're called chawls. They're these residential buildings, sort of like an isolated village, called a chawl. And we randomly assigned 50 chawls to different targeting algorithms. Here are cartoons of the networks of 3 chawls. These are the networks of the female heads of household. And we gave them an intervention related to the purchase of iron fortified salt to treat perinatal anemia. And here are 3 illustrative networks. On the far left is a network in which we chose random targeting. We chose about 20% of the people in each chawl to be targeted. On the far right, on the far left, we show the targets are shown in hexagons, and the purple perimeter is shown in the legend in the upper right, shows if the people were chosen at random or not. And then we colored the interior according to whether people adopt. And of course, the people could be colored purple, either because they were treated or even if they were untreated, they could have learned from someone else. And the illustrative results are shown in the little tabular numbers on the bottom. The chawl size is about the same on all of them. There were 50 chawls. There's just some random variation here. 61 people, 66 people, 59 people. We chose 20% of the people as targets. So you can see the number of targets, 12, 13, and 8, about the same in all of them. But now let's look at how many people in the entire chawl, whether they were targeted or not, adopted the intervention. In the random targeting, 7 people adopted. In the friendship nomination, many more, 12 people adopted. And in the pair targeting, in this illustration, 21 people adopted, even though everything else was counterfactually the same. Now, to be clear, we are affected in another way by social networks. It's not just what's happening around us, whether people are adopting iron fortified salt, that matters. The actual structure of the network also matters. Think about these two objects. As you all learned in high school chemistry, they are both made of carbon. If you take the carbon atoms and connect them one way, you get graphite, which is soft and dark. Or you take the same carbon atoms and connect them another way, and you get diamond, which is hard and clear. And there are two key intellectual ideas there. First of all, these properties of softness and darkness and hardness and clearness are not properties of the carbon atoms, they are properties of the collection of carbon atoms. And second, which properties you get depends on how you connect the carbon atoms to each other. Take the same carbon atoms and connect them one way, you get one set of properties. Connect them another way, you get a completely different set of properties. And it's the same with human groups. It's the ties between people that can make the whole greater than the sum of its parts. New properties, such as cooperation and violence, health and happiness, wealth and innovation, can emerge because of the connections, because of the ties between people, and not necessarily because of the people themselves. So it's not just what's happening in the people around us, whether they are altruistic or happy or rich or adopting maternal and child health practices that matters. Our experience of the world also depends on the actual structure of the ties around us near and far. So let me show you a couple of experiments where we intervene and manipulate the connections of the individuals. This was an early experiment we did, published in 2011, and it involved the manipulation of connection to affect how cooperative people in a group might be. So earlier I showed you the contagion of cooperation. Now I'm going to show you how connection can affect cooperation. So if you look at this image, what we did is we created these networks that looked realistic, and then we recruited hundreds of people using a software that we wrote that's publicly available and an online labor market. So over the last 20 years, over 40,000 people have participated in our online experiments. There were a few hundred, I don't remember how many. There were 758 subjects in this experiment. And they were dropped into little networks that we made, and they were introduced to their neighbors. Each one had different neighbors, and they were given some money to play a public goods game like I described before. In the bottom row, we show a sequence of snapshots of the network across 10 rounds of the game. We color the dots red if people are defectors, if they don't contribute and take advantage of their neighbors, otherwise blue. And at the beginning of the bottom sequence, you see that some of the nodes are blue. Actually, on average, about 60% of the nodes are blue. People start by being nice. But then they're exploited by their neighbors. Their neighbors start defecting and taking advantage of them. And they have no choice. They either can be suckers and keep being nice to their neighbors, or they also start defecting. And what you find on the bottom row is by the end, everyone has become a defector. Most of the dots are red, except for a few blue dots on the perimeter of the network, keeping civilization alive. In a different branch of the experiment, we changed the rules of connection. In addition to having people decide whether to cooperate or defect at every round, we also gave them a little opportunity to rewire the networks around them, to cut ties or make ties to other people. And what we found in that branch of the experiment was that we could preserve cooperation such that cooperation would endure and most of the dots would remain blue. The point is, I can take all of you on this call and I can wire you one way together, and you're very nice to each other. Or I take you same people and wire you in a different topology, and you're mean jerks to each other. So this property of being mean or nice is not just a property of you, it's a property of how the network is wired, just like the carbon example. Now, in a subsequent experiment, we swept the parameter space of the rewiring rate, like how much rewiring was permissible, from 0 to 100% on the x-axis. So 0%, again, the network was fixed. 100%, you could change every tie at every time step and everything in between. And we found this kind of parabolic shape where the optimal amount of rewiring is somewhere in the middle. And during the Q&A, if we have time, I can come back to talk about some of the explicit social implications of this observation. Now, in another experiment that we did, which was more recent, we dropped people into these two networks that are shown here. Now, these two networks are extremely interesting because by design, they both have 15 people, and they both have exactly 18 connections. So they're 15 nodes and 18 connections. And in addition, they both have the same exact so-called degree distribution. That is, if you look at how many people have D of one connection, 6 people have 1 connection in both networks. And how many people have 2 connections? 3 people have 2 connections in both networks. And how many people have 3 connections? 3 people. And how many people have 5 connections? 3 people in both networks have 5 connections. But the wiring diagram is completely different, as you can immediately see visually. And the organizing mathematical principle for this is whether or not popular people are attached to popular people on the right-hand network, called assortativity, the assortative network, or popular people are preferentially attached to unpopular people, or disassortative networks, as shown on the left. Actually, the left-hand network is what the airport network in our country is, right? So we have a hub and spoke system. So popular airports are attached to unpopular airports. It's not like all the hubs are connected and all the small airports are connected. But that organization of all the popular people are connected to each other and unpopular people are connected to each other is actually a property of human social networks, as shown on the right. And what we found in this experiment is we could randomly assign people to these networks, again, have them play a kind of public goods game. And we found that the overall happiness of the people in these systems was higher when they were put into an assortative network, which is the real kind of networks human beings evolved to make, and was not as high, was lower if they were put into a disassortative network. So structure matters, just like, again, in the carbon example. Okay, so I have one more experiment with respect to position, and then some final ideas that I'd like to close with. This is an experiment here that involves the manipulation of position and also exploring some other ideas that my lab has been doing more recently involving the use of artificial intelligence. And we're exploring the performance of groups engaged in collective coordination tasks and not just cooperation tasks like the couple of examples I've discussed so far. And one paradigm of this type of collective action problem is the so-called color coordination task, where people must pick a color dissimilar than their neighbors, and the whole group is incentivized to converge on a solution. So this is an example of a game, the color coordination game, in which a group of people have to work together to solve a problem. And in this game, the problem is everyone in the group has to pick a color dissimilar from their neighbors. And if they are all able to do that, so that everyone colors themselves so that no one has a color identical to their neighbors, then the group gets paid. So in the far left here, you can see a cartoon of this game. Is again a network. There are 3 possible colors, purple, orange, and yellow. People are dropped at random into this network, and they are given a random initial color. And you can see that, for example, on the far left, there's a guy that's orange, and he's connected to another orange guy above him and a yellow guy to the right of him. And we color the color conflicts red. So ties, connections between people where the 2 people have the same color and hence are in conflict, are colored red. And you can see at the starting point of that network that by chance there's some colors, but what the orange guy should do is pick purple. If he switches to purple, the guy on the far left, he'll no longer be in conflict with the orange guy or the yellow guy that he's connected to. In the bottom of this image, we show the time. These people have 5 minutes to solve this game in seconds. And on the y-axis, we show the objective function, or the number of color conflicts. So at the beginning, there are 12 color conflicts, and there are 2 kinds of conflicts. Resolvable conflicts, where a human being can make a color change that solves the problem, like the orange guy on the far left picking purple, that solves the problem for him. Or unresolvable conflicts, where a person can't make a change that solves the color conflicts in his graph. And those are shown in orange. So at the time 0, there are 12 color conflicts overall. People start changing their colors, bang, bang, bang. By 105 seconds, everyone has done a good job, except the 2 yellow guys in the middle. They're in conflict with each other, but they're stuck. It's an unresolvable conflict because they cannot change either to orange or purple without increasing the number of conflicts in their neighborhood. So one of them has to make a counterintuitive move. One of those yellow guys has to say, you know what? I'm going to switch to orange or purple, even though that increases my conflicts, which is what they do. And then by the end, at 245 seconds, everyone has solved the problem, and the group as a whole gets paid. If they hadn't solved it, by 5 minutes, they would have gotten nothing. And then, because we are sneaky, we randomly replaced 3 of the people with bots. And we endowed these bots with very simple forms of artificial intelligence. Specifically, what we did in this case is we gave the bots the capacity to have a little bit of noise, to make some random moves occasionally. And what we're doing in this experiment, and many others like it in my lab, is we're evaluating what we call hybrid systems of humans and machines. Is it possible to add some bots to human groups and improve the group's performance? And so in this experiment, as I said, we added 3 bots, and we had 4,000 people in 230 groups in this experiment. And we randomly assigned 2 axes. We manipulated how noisy the bots were. So in the 0 noise situation, every 1.5 seconds, the bot looks at its neighbors and simply picks the color that minimizes conflicts with its neighbors. In the 10% noise example, it does that, but 10% of the time it makes a crazy choice, picks a color at random. And in the 30% noise example, it does that, but 30% of the time it picks a random color. And then we manipulated the position of the bots. This is a position intervention, where the bots randomly located in the first row, put in the center of the network in the second row, or in the periphery of the network. These show group-wise survival curves. On the x-axis is time, game time, up to 5 minutes. And on the y-axis is the probability that the group has not solved the coordination game. The orange line shows the control groups, about 30 groups that had just humans, no bots. How well did they perform? And at the beginning, 100% of the groups had not solved the coordination game. The y-axis goes from 0 to 100%. And then as time goes by, more and more solve them, so that by 5 minutes, something like 60 or 65% of the human groups had solved the game. What we found was that if we had 10% noise bots that we put in the middle of the network, as shown in the central image here, we could substantially enhance the ability of these groups to solve the problem. And in fact, we could induce a 55.6% acceleration in the median time of solution of the game. And we found that both perfect bots and too noisy bots were unhelpful. And bots positioned randomly or peripherally were also unhelpful. But one of the interesting things about this experiment is that the humans learned to play better by having bots among them. And not just among those humans who were directly connected to the bots. This is an idea we can also return to in the Q&A, because there are many amazing examples of how the addition of AI changes how humans behave in the presence of AI. In our experiments, the point was that the bots help the humans to help themselves. And we are building on this work to design and add simple bots to these situations shown here and others involving social dilemmas and collective action problems. Can we engineer types of artificial intelligence which, when added into structured human populations, increase coordination, cooperation, communication, innovation, evacuation, navigation, and contribution to the collective well-being? And we want to explore what we call dumb AI that might be effective, and not just noisiness or geodesic position. In other words, in my laboratory, we are not focused on developing super smart AI to replace human cognition. We're not trying to develop large language models or AlphaGo or AlphaFold. We're not trying to develop super smart AI to replace human cognition, but rather dumb AI to supplement human interaction. And precisely because this dumb AI is dropped among smart humans, all the AI has to do is function as a catalyst, gently helping the humans to perform better in these collective challenges. And we have many more experiments. I just showed you one that was published in Nature in 2017. That was our initial experiment, but since then we've had quite a few. All right, let me close in the 3 minutes remaining for me with one final idea. And this has to do with what it means when we intervene in a social network. Because I think that such interventions provide us with a way to manipulate social capital. Now, to understand one sense, consider this idea. What's the point of a connected life? How does it help us as individuals and as a species? And it turns out that networks are a resource that we can all use. Networks are a kind of social capital. Now, most people, when they think about capital, think about money. But really, capital is any stock of resources that can be put to productive use. And 2 further key ideas about capital are that in order to create capital, You have to invest skill and effort. In other words, in order to create a reservoir of wealth, to create capital, you have to know something and do something. And second, and more subtle, and in an idea that's been keeping me awake for 20 years, I've been struggling with this idea, is that in order to create capital, at its core, what you need to do is make changes in a substance that make it yield a higher rate of return than it otherwise would. That at its most fundamental, the capital creation process is about the transmogrification of the natural world, transforming one thing into another that makes it a reservoir of wealth and a source of productive power. For example, a farm is a stock of capital. By investing labor and skill to clear the forest, we make the land much more productive of fruits and grains and vegetables and flowers, for example. So land, especially improved land, is a form of capital. Or here, you can take this tree, you can invest skill and effort, and the tree is a stock of capital, but then you can invest skill and effort and convert it into lumber, which is more valuable than the tree because you can do things with the lumber you couldn't do with a tree. Namely, invest still more skill and effort and make it into a violin. And the violin is more valuable than the lumber because you can do things with a violin you couldn't do with a lumber, namely make music. So at each step of the way, you transform one thing into another, endow it with new properties, which makes it a reservoir of wealth and a source of productive power. So capital is a change that allows the substance to act in a new way. Now, a key innovation in thinking took place in the 1960s to see people and their skills and talents as a form of human capital. And the chief example of this is education. If we endow someone with skills and knowledge, we have changed them and they become more productive. We have changed them in a way similar to the other types of capital that we've been discussing. And they can now earn a higher rate of return on investment, yielding income just like the wood. So if you take this former graduate student of mine on the far left who's a dissolute drunkard, and you clean him up and you send him to Alcoholics Anonymous, and now he's more productive than he was before. Or you can make still more of an investment and give him a proper education, and here at Columbia. And you can, and now he's still more productive. So at each step, we've made changes to this person's mind. Even now, for example, ostensibly, I am investing skill and effort, and I'm changing the neurons of your brains. I am making ostensibly you guys capable and more productive than you were before the start of this call. Well, just like physical capital is created by a change in the material world, and human capital is a change in persons, social capital in organizations, in companies, in communities, or our whole society is a change in the relations among persons, a change that renders the group more productive and capable of doing things it was not previously able to do. And that is the deepest account I can give you of what social networks mean for our lives and why it is and how it is that we can use them to make the world better. Thank you.
Wow, Nicholas, that was incredible. I really admire how you've created this field and systematically built evidence around many of the major questions. In fact, it reminds me of how when I was an undergraduate, you were my teaching assistant in a house seminar and really were the inspiration for me to become an academic so I could also ask these kinds of questions. So thank you for inspiring all of us and an incredible talk. We have a lot of questions that have come across. I'm going to encourage people to add more to the Q&A. We'll get to as many as we can. And let me start with this one. So one of the questions that comes up is how much can you amplify the effect of an intervention that's targeted to individuals? You used an example of picking 6 people in the center of a network, maybe getting 10x the effect. I'm wondering, what does the distribution look like of how much amplification there might be? I'm also, of course, wondering in what sort of context would the combination of human and machines best be used to amplify those effects?
So that is a big unknown. In our science paper, we looked at 117 interventions, and there was a variation. For some things, there was 0% social contagion, and for other things, there was much more social contagion. And it's very hard to have first principles that tell you what is going to be more contagious ex ante. Now, we explore in that paper some general principles, some of which will be obvious to this audience, like knowledge spreads more easily than practices. It's much easier to get people to adopt, learn something than to change their behavior, for example. But we also looked at other things. For example, we looked at, are things that are easier to adopt for the ego also those things which necessarily will be more spreadable? And that doesn't have to be the same. For example, things that individual, you might like a movie, you might think a movie is good or bad, but that's different than whether you tell your friends about it. You might tell your friends about a bad movie, right? So the spreadability of a thing is not necessarily the same or even related to it necessarily, although we find that it is related to the probability that an ego will adopt it. So we look at some of those things. If you give me a minute, I can tell you a kind of slightly off color example. It's a medical example. I don't know how many of the people in this audience are doctors. They won't find it off color at all if they're doctors. It's about sexually transmitted diseases. Do I have a minute to give this example?
Sure.
Okay, so imagine that there are two islands in the Pacific Ocean, and on one island, and on neither island is there an outbreak of sexually transmitted diseases. And on one island, everyone is having sex with everyone else. In network terms, that's a fully saturated graph. So you have 100 times 99 divided by 2, 4,550 connections. And on the other island, nobody's having sex with anyone else. But now a sailor washes up on shore and he has sex with one person. There's a shipwreck offshore. Now a guy washes up on shore. He has sex with one person. Where do you get the bigger outbreak? Pretty obvious. You get it in the fully saturated graph. So the point there is that the network structure plays a big role in the size of the epidemic. And you can imagine that there's every network structure in between the two extremes that I just mentioned. And the details of that structure are going to be relevant to the size of the cascade. Now imagine that you have two islands. Everyone is having sex with everyone else on this island. Everyone is having sex with everyone else on this island. No outbreak. But on this island, everyone is immunocompetent. And on this island, everyone is immunocompromised. That means the functioning of their own immune systems in their own bodies. They might have HIV, for example, or leukemia that affects their immune system function. Sailor washes up on shore, has sex with one person. You should have the intuition that the outbreak will be bigger amongst the immunocompromised individuals. So the point there is that it's not just the structure of the network, it's attributes of individuals themselves, which also affect the size of the cascade. And now here's the kicker. In a little bit of medical knowledge that I don't know how many doctors there are on this call, but if you have sex with someone with active syphilis, you have about a 1 in 3 chance of contracting syphilis. Whereas if you have sex with someone with active HIV, you have about a 1 in 500 chance, depends on a lot of factors, but approximately, of contracting HIV. So now, two islands, everyone has sex with everyone else here and there. Everyone's immunocompetent here. Everyone's immunocompetent there. A sailor washes up on shore and has syphilis here and HIV there. Where do you get the bigger outbreak? Of course, with syphilis. So it's not just properties of the network. It's not just properties of individuals. It's properties of the thing itself that affect the size of the epidemic. Now, with biological pathogens, we have 150 years of knowledge to be able to make predictions about which kind of pathogens are more contagious. But with memes, with behaviors, with ideas, we don't have the same fund of knowledge. And it's extremely difficult ex ante. With pathogens, you can say, how big are they? Do they have a hydrophobic or hydrophilic encapsulation? How immunogenic are they? And so on. But with non-pathogens, it's very difficult. So it's hard to give you general principles on that. On the AI example, we have a whole plethora of experiments that explore the conditions under which AI can be useful. And I can talk more about that or take other questions as you wish.
Yeah, let's go to another question which relates to some of what you just said. So we know our behavior is influenced by others, but we also have innate tendencies and prior experiences. In studying this, how do you differentiate between the effect of the network versus those innate characteristics? So let's say, for example, there's a distribution in how altruistic people in a network are. How do you determine the degree to which a bad player serves as a stop to altruistic behavior spread? How do you quantify the relative effects of the innate characteristics and the effect of the network?
So because we do experiments, we don't have to worry about that too much, right? We randomly assign people to different treatments and different groups, and we do it for very large samples. So it doesn't matter is the answer. However, we are still curious. And you can then use regression-based frameworks to assess to what extent does your behavior depend on your own innate propensity or the environment into which you are dropped experimentally. And the questioner is actually right, both matter. The extent to which the relative mattering of those two things, individual propensities versus social propensities, is seen will again depend on the circumstances. Innately, about when you put people in a so-called dictator game situation, cross-culturally around the world, on average, about 2/3 of people start by being nice. Most people are nice in their initial interactions. About 1/3 are jerks at the get-go. But people, as I talked about in the experiment I discussed, if you're surrounded by other jerks, even if you're nice, you don't remain nice very long. So you have an innate propensity to be nice, but your social environment now changes your behavior. And we generally find that the social environment is more important, but that's not the case for everything. It's just the case for some of the things that we look at.
Yeah. All right. Well, tons of other interesting questions coming in. Quick one here. Interesting observation, learning how to be kind influences downstream behavior by others. You mentioned 3 degrees of separation. Is this limited to 3 degrees, or is that what was measured? Is there a dilution of the effect with each succeeding interaction? How much variability is there in the degree to which the observed behavior is passed on?
So the key point of the 3 degrees of influence rule is that it is just a rule of thumb. Some things don't spread at all, 0 degrees of influence. Some things spread 1, some things spread 2, 3, or 4 degrees of separation. Our main intellectual point is that it spreads more than 1. In other words, your social influence doesn't just stop at the social horizon of your friends. When you quit smoking, it doesn't just affect the probability that your friends will quit smoking. Or when you get a colonoscopy, it doesn't just affect the probability that your friends will get a colonoscopy, or your wife gets a colonoscopy. It affects your wife's sister or your coworker's spouse. Now we'll get a colonoscopy because you got a colonoscopy, for example. So the main intellectual point is that peer effects don't stop at 1 degree. They cascade within these complex networks. Now, empirically, it has turned out to be the case, both in observational networks and in many experiments that we've done. For example, in the Honduras experiment that I talked about that was published in Science 6 or 8 months ago, we also looked at, did it spread beyond the friends of the targeted people? And the answer is yes. We could find quantitative evidence of spread to 2 degrees of separation. So if I teach you how to take care of your baby's umbilical cord, it has a detectable effect on the probability your untreated friend will take care of her baby's umbilical cord, and your untreated friend of your untreated friend will also be more likely to take better care of the umbilical cord. So we find spread approximately to a social horizon of 3 degrees of separation. And there are 3 possible explanations for this. This is discussed in my book, Connected. The simplest explanation is a kind of social friction, or like the children's game of telephone, a kind of degradation in the quality of information as it moves, as it spreads out from you. As this social wave spreads out, it's just like when you drop a pebble into a pond, the waves don't spread to cover the whole planet. The waves dampen down as they spread, and eventually all the energy all the potential energy that's converted into kinetic energy when it hits the surface, and then you get the waves, through friction is converted to heat. And that's basically what happens in these social systems as well. There are also some other very interesting reasons, one of which I could spend as much time as you want, but to get more questions, I'll just state it briefly, one of the several other reasons. And that is that there is a kind of social fluidity like electron shells. So remember the S, D, and F shells we learned in high school physics or high school chemistry. Your friends are the same from year to year, and your spouse is the same from year to year. But your friends of friends and your friends of friends of friends, those outer social orbits are much more fluid. So when you send a message to 1 degree of separation, it reliably gets there because those people are still there by the time the message arrives. But when you send it to 2 or 3 degrees of separation, it never reaches those people because they've moved on. That's the essence of the idea.
Got it. Given the challenges that induction, homophily, and context create, how can a beginner, say a manager in a company who's read one of your books, use social network analysis to improve how well the organization functions?
Well, first of all, we have worked with many firms, and we have implemented some of these ideas in commercial settings. I could give some examples of this. You could certainly analyze your outcomes. For example, we worked with one firm that was looking at the inventiveness of its engineers. They had 2,000 engineers working for them. Was there any evidence that a creative engineer fostered creativity in other engineers to whom they were connected, for example? So first of all, there's software where you can map the networks. There are analytic techniques you can use with observational data, econometric techniques. You can do your own experiments if you want. But the most general answer I would give you is that actually, as a manager, you don't actually care whether it's contagion or homophily or context. You just want better performance. So if you use interventions that are contagion interventions, even if part of the effect relates to homophily and context, that's fine. You get a better outcome. You may not know exactly how much was due to contagion, but it doesn't matter. You want to reduce. One firm we worked with had 50 factories, and they had different accident rates at different factories. And they were wondering to what extent did the accident rates at different factories relate to the competence of the individuals, the human capital, like were they immunocompetent or immunocompromised, or to what extent was it the network of interactions in those factories? And would a safety intervention spread out within the network? But even if there was some homophily there, who cares? You're just going to get a safer factory when you do the kind of work.
Yeah. So as I feared might be true, time is going very quickly, and we may just have time for one more question. So how could friendship nomination methods be used to improve so-called relational organization to, for example, target context to increase voter registration or turnout? And abstracting from that, if one wanted to mount a campaign that was about, let's say, increasing bipartisan support for biomedical research, how might one think about how to leverage these principles?
Well, first of all, on the voting thing, my colleague, James Fowler, published a huge randomized controlled trial of 61 people on Facebook. Actually, the lead author was a guy by the name of Bond, but James, I think, was a senior author on that paper, published in Nature like in 2012 or something. 61 million people were randomized, and it was shown that voting spreads in social networks. And we've done many other pro-social experiments. We haven't looked specifically at the support, trying to increase the support of research, but many political scientists have studied how the networks of interactions among legislators affects what they do. I don't have time to pull it up now, but there's a magnificent study that looks at political polarization in Congress over the last 60 years. And they look like mitotic spindles. Some of you may have seen this image with the red and the blue like pulling apart over the 50 years. And you can imagine some connection interventions, brokering introductions between people of different parties that might help. And we know this anecdotally as well, that these cross-aisle friendships that arise among United States senators in particular are extremely important in the functioning of the Senate. So I don't have a specific answer to you on how we can increase bipartisan support for research, but I can tell you that that support for research, like any other social phenomenon, likely spreads by contagion. And I can tell you that the structure of interactions among the legislators matters. I'll give you one example. My brother is the physician-in-chief for Special Olympics. And he was telling me about going to the United States Congress recently. They do this every year or 2 years, and they meet with all the doctors in Congress who come from both the right and the left. And guess what? Special Olympics is like a nonpartisan issue. Everyone is really happy to talk about Special Olympics. And that's a way you can build connections, right? Here are doctors who are coming together to talk about disabled children. And they're going to work together on that, and maybe they'll form some bonds, and maybe that'll help them work on other issues that are not quite as uncontentious.
Yeah, no, it's a great example. So thank you so much, Nicholas, for inspiring all of us in the amazing work that you have been doing and continue to do. We all are grateful for you spending the time with us. We hope everyone who was able to join today enjoyed today's seminar. We hope you will join us for one of our upcoming seminars. And if you do want to stay in the loop on future events, please make sure to subscribe to the CHIBE and BCFG newsletters or follow us on Blue Sky or X. Thank you again to everyone.
I'm on Blue Sky too, by the way. Yeah.
Thank you again to everyone for joining us. And thank you so much, Nicholas. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me.